Thanks everybody for joining today's webinar. I'll just wait another 15 seconds or so to allow a few more folks to settle in before we get started. So welcome to today's discussion, the second session of the breakdown, where Steve Levitsky and I talk about the struggle for democracy in the US, reflect on historical precedents in the US and abroad, and offer evidence-based reflections on the path forward. My name is Erica Chenoweth, and I'm the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm speaking in my individual capacity as a scholar. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to share. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. A couple of logistics. Today's discussion is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording afterward. The video will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel, and we encourage your participation. You can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure there's ample time for audience questions at the end of our discussion today. So before we go any further, let me introduce Steve Levitsky, who is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, Professor of Government, and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a Senior Democracy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weakened informal institutions, particularly in Latin America. He is co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and was published in 30 languages, and Tyranny of the Minority: Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. Steve, it's great to be with you again.
It's great to be back.
So on our last webinar, we talked a lot about the surprising speed of autocratic consolidation in the United States. In October, when we last talked, a lot of the momentum seemed to be in that direction. But it has been a busy month of news, and in no particular order since we last spoke in a webinar. We've had a record-breaking government shutdown with a set of high-stakes court battles over the withholding of SNAP benefits. A handful of Democratic senators ultimately ended the shutdown through negotiations with GOP colleagues in the Senate. We've seen multiple elections that showed strong enthusiasm for progressive and liberal candidates over Trump-backed ones, and that resulted in some claims by the GOP that the results were fraudulent, or at least by Trump. There were oral arguments within the Supreme Court that signaled skepticism among the court about Trump's self-proclaimed tariff authorities. There was some fracturing on the right over the Epstein files, including a high-profile resignation of erstwhile Trump ally Marjorie Taylor Greene. Trump again calling for Jimmy Kimmel to be sacked. ICE deployments to Charlotte that were met with substantial community resistance. Substantial saber rattling by the US military in Venezuela. A video released by Democratic lawmakers calling for the military and intelligence officers to disobey unlawful orders, and a response from the president that they should be prosecuted and executed for doing so. There was a surprisingly friendly meeting between the New York mayor-elect Zoran Mamdani and Trump in the Oval Office this week, and the release of a so-called peace plan for Ukraine that might as well have been written by the Kremlin, and more. So Americans could be forgiven for finding this sequence of events both dizzying and confusing. And so I want to ask you, Steve, what one or two developments you think have been the most consequential in terms of the struggle for American democracy this month, both on the backsliding side and on the democracy defending side?
I'll circle back to a couple, but I think maybe the most important thing is there have been a flurry of fronts on which the Trump administration has suffered defeats, and that's new compared to when we spoke a little over a month ago. The election defeat was maybe the clearest in terms of telling us something about public opinion. The congressional vote on the Epstein case was a major political defeat for Trump, really the first time that the Republican Party or elements of the Republican Party had stood up to him in many years. That just recently, just I guess today, the Comey and Letitia James cases were thrown out in court. That's another important defeat. And I don't know if you mentioned the gerrymandering, but I'm sure when we last spoke, one of my greatest concerns regarding the upcoming elections was this offensive in an effort to effectively steal as many upwards of a dozen seats, so that even if the Republicans lost the popular vote in the House, they might be able to retain um, through shenanigans a legislative majority. That we haven't seen the last chapter written yet, but that effort looks like it's going down to a smashing defeat. And so the Trump waged war on many fronts in his first 9 months, and that was shocking, and I think allowed the administration to move both faster and in a more radical way than many people anticipated. But Trump picked a lot of fights, and he's starting to lose some fights. And so I think most importantly is the number of defeats he's suffered in the last month, which certainly hasn't stopped, but has slowed this authoritarian offensive.
So let's talk about the election results first, and then we can return to the gerrymandering effort and the redistricting fight that was set up also to some degree by the election results out of California. So it seems to me that the election results on November 4th were consequential really for a couple main reasons. The first is that, as I mentioned at the top, like Trump did come out and basically try to say these elections went against the GOP interests because they were rigged or they were fraudulent or whatever. And I don't think that claim resonated this time much beyond his most committed base. I just didn't see it get picked up and used to explain the election. There were a lot of conversations among GOP talking heads in the days after the election where they were basically saying things like, these were expected results in blue areas. They were local elections. You shouldn't read more into these outcomes than that they were just like, basically blue state elections or blue city elections, and they went blue and nobody should be surprised. That was the primary talking point. The primary talking point was not that the elections were fraudulent and that's why you got these outcomes. And I think that's really important because as we'll talk about shortly, I think like setting up the 2026 midterms is a really, an important inflection point in determining which path the country takes. I do think it's nevertheless troubling and alarming that such claims were made at all, and that there is at least some part of the committed base that is eager to continue to accept those claims, but it just didn't really bounce in the way that 2020 did, for example. The good news out of this, I think, is that people generally trust elections in the United States. Like, generally speaking, that is still holding, and I think that that's an important baseline from which to build both trust and expectations going into the midterms. The second reason I thought these elections were pretty consequential was related to turnout. So in New York, it's often talked about that Mamdani got more votes alone than any mayoral candidate since the 1960s in the city. But I think that beyond New York City, turnout was very strong in some of these other elections, whether they were gubernatorial ones or whether there were some of the lesser known elections around the country, like the elections in Mississippi for state legislators and senators that broke the GOP's supermajority in Mississippi. The first non-federal statewide elections in Georgia that went to Democrats since 2006 through the public utility regulator elections, and then the Supreme Court elections in Pennsylvania, which is really consequential because of its role in the 2020 kind of election denial fight. So I think those are really important because it suggests that there is, whether or not it's tied to any party, particularly, there is a significant number of people who are continuing to see casting a vote as a primary way of pushing back against the policies or against the direction of the country in general. And these outcomes from our elections that happened a few weeks ago have clearly made both parties think seriously about the 2026 midterm elections and beyond them. So President Trump has said in response to those election outcomes that he wants to see significant reforms to elections across the country prior to the midterms, which would include ending absentee ballots and mail-in voting, requiring IDs to vote, eliminating what he describes as widespread voter fraud, and also the gerrymander, redistricting in a number of states. And he's really pushing for that. Now, in the meantime, there are efforts underway in several states to redraw districts, or there are conversations about doing so that sometimes have failed in some states. And the one that was underway in Texas, as you mentioned, has now been challenged in court, and that leaves a lot of the other efforts in limbo for the time being. And one of the things that's interesting is that a ballot measure that received significant support was California's measure to redistrict in response to Texas's effort if it proceeded. So I think, the 2026 elections, as I mentioned, are going to be an inflection point, and this is something that's common in countries that are experiencing a backsliding episode, that even though a lot of times elections are contested, they're still one of the most important sites for people to mobilize collective action to push back on backsliding. And so one of the questions that arises is how to effectively prepare for that. So if these competing frames are still being actively contested heading into the 2026 elections, how do pro-democracy forces both win the elections and protect the results under competitive authoritarianism specifically? So this is different from just getting candidates to win in an established democracy, knowing, as you've said, that part of the way that we know we're in a competitive authoritarian system, if we are in one, is that the opposition is sort of bullied to the sidelines. How do they get off the sidelines and back into the game? And then also, how do they stay on the field, even as they begin to get bullied off of it?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, in terms of candidates, we don't see much in the way of taking to the sidelines. There's still, luckily, a number of ambitious and in some cases very talented Democratic Party politicians, and in some cases independents, preparing to contest upcoming elections. So that's very good news. For election shenanigans, fraud, and other forms of manipulation, intimidation, gerrymandering, the various forms of shenanigans that might go on, that's much easier in close elections. And so one of the things that this election did in 2025 is it's really, really hard to steal an election by 15 points. And so the kind of numbers that we saw in particularly New Jersey and Virginia, which were supposed to be relatively close elections. Virginia is a pretty purple state. New Jersey, not quite, but it had been getting a little bit purple. This was places where Republicans expected to be competitive, and they got blown out. And that suggested, if the numbers are anything like that, it gets much, much harder to steal elections in 2026. That's going to change the calculation of Republican actors, whether it is local politicians, state level politicians, state legislators, local election officials, those who are thinking about gerrymandering their states. All of them have to calculate, well, what is the environment going to be like? Is it going to be an environment where it's a really close election and Trump is still really strong, in which case they probably would cooperate with various forms of shenanigans? Or is this likely to be a blowout and Trump is on his way out, in which case I don't want to get caught with my pants down? And one of the very, very positive things for democracy about this election outcome in 2025 is it suggests that the Democrats could rack up potentially some very, very big numbers in 2026, which doesn't make fraud impossible, but it makes it a lot harder and will probably convince a number of state and local level Republicans not to try, not to take that risk. Now, stepping back, I mean, one of this could go, I think, in two broad ways. Trump is weakening. He is weaker than when last we spoke. His public approval rating has really slid in the last month, and his electoral competitiveness has diminished considerably. What does the White House do? What does the Republican leadership do if it calculates it can't win in 2026 or it's going to lose big? There are two very different roads you could follow. I actually debate this with my co-author, Daniel Ziblatt. One is a weaker Trump or a weaker Republican Party may not try, may simply decide we're too weak, we can't pull it off. Maybe the rank and file doesn't want to go along with it. They just cannot marshal the forces to carry out some form. And we can talk about different forms of shenanigans, but they may just not try, and we could end up with a relatively normal election. Alternatively, they double down and they go for something, a pretty radical Hail Mary, because that's probably what it will take. I mean, if things, obviously much can change in the next year, but if things go as they're going, everything indicates that Trump is going to be in pretty poor electoral shape for the midterm. The economy is not going to be great. Affordability is not going to be resolved. Nothing that the Trump administration is doing is especially popular. I mean, one bind that it's gotten itself into is it invested very heavily on this very, very high profile, very public, very cruel mass deportation scheme, which clearly affected the party, not surprisingly, among Latino voters, right? This was supposed to be the big addition to the Republican electoral coalition. All of them, just lost all the gains of 2024, especially in New Jersey. And so what are they going to do? How are they going to win back those votes? They don't look like they're about to abandon. Either they abandon what ICE is doing, or they're going to bleed Latino votes. So this party's in electoral difficulty. And I don't know if they will just sort of give up because it's too risky, or whether they'll try a serious Hail Mary. But they're in a much, much more difficult situation than they were a couple of months ago. How do you prepare for that? I mean, I think there's a division of labor. The Democratic Party, when it comes to elections, when it comes to election time, politicians' job is primarily to win elections. They have to figure out the best way to win votes and pursue votes. That's what those guys are trained to do. That's what they do best. And that's what's most important for democracy. The opposition party winning as many elections as possible by as much as possible is one of the single most important things we can do for democracy. I think the rest of us do, lawyers, civil society organizations, democracy groups of all kinds, academics, need to be thinking about how to defend democracy. It's something that, we haven't faced significant electoral fraud in the United States in a very long time. And there's a lot of uncertainty over what the shenanigans will be. I mean, I think we know for a fact that this government would like to play dirty, right? The gerrymandering scheme has already indicated that they're willing to play dirty. There have been there's this push to eliminate mail-in voting. I have no idea how far that would go. Mail-in voting is quite popular among Republicans in many places. There is certainly a danger of using ICE, border officials, National Guard, or militias to intimidate voters. The mobilizations in the cities also have not gone well. There was a lot of pushback in Chicago, as you mentioned, a lot of pushback in Charlotte. So it's not, if they were piloting intimidation over the last few months, that hasn't worked very well either, but that's another path. There's a path of contesting results, but again, and there's potentially a path of manipulating voter rolls, although the legal capacity of the federal government to do that is pretty limited. So I think we know remarkably little about what they will try and how invested they are in these different strategies. But and so I don't have too much to say about how to defend against it because it's so uncertain. But I agree with you that there is a much higher than zero risk that they will really go for it. Given the level of corruption in this administration, these guys have a lot to lose if there's a Democratic majority in the House after 2026.
Yeah, I mean, on that last point, it strikes me that these 2025 elections were elections that they just didn't care that much about, whereas the 2026 elections they might really care about, and both parties really care about winning this one, and regaining the House of Representatives for the Democrats or keeping it for the Republican Party. And so it just might be higher stakes, and then you might see more risky behavior. And as you say, there's a huge range of uncertain pathways and outcomes for that. I think one of the things that people often ask me is like, what can people do in their local communities to support, both voting and then defending the vote? And I think I've heard a couple of really useful ways of looking at this. One is that that voting is really important, and people should be encouraging everyone they know to turn out and vote. And do that right up until and through election day. And then there's a shift to making sure that the votes are respected, right? And the shift to the votes being respected, it's important that that effort starts after the votes are cast, because it's a bit of a delicate matter to imply that votes aren't going to be counted, right? So people sometimes don't want to turn out if they think an election is going to go sideways. So the idea of encouraging people to expect that their votes will be counted is important, and then encouraging the votes to be counted is also important. There's in the advance of the 2020 election, there was a big civil society effort to protect the results. And there were some really useful like grassroots tools that were provided and released during that. One of them is called the Hold the Line Guide, which was developed by a few different civil society groups and sort of premiered in advance of the 2020 elections. And it encouraged people basically to gather around their community and find out like who their election administrators were, and ask them in advance of the election to share with them what their procedures were to make sure that the votes were counted and that the votes would be respected and certified and the like. And so it provided a lot of, I think, really useful material that can translate beyond just the 2020 elections and encourage people to feel like they have some agency over the outcome, especially locally. So, Steve, we were going to move ahead by talking about how opposition parties behave and what you're seeing from the Democratic Party today. So it's no secret that the Democratic Party is still struggling too with low approval ratings. And voters seem divided about the party's shutdown strategy, the future of the party's leadership, and whether the party can more effectively position itself to resist backsliding. Democratic Party leaders have sometimes responded to these critiques by pointing out that they're out of power and therefore unable to substantially push back from their position. Can you talk a little bit about how opposition parties have behaved in other contexts to defend against backsliding attempts?
Yeah, sure. First of all, many apologies. I have not one, but two computers simultaneously failing me at right now. So I got one that's working, but the video is not working. So many apologies for that. I've got a slightly unorthodox position on all of this, which folks may or may not agree with. But from my comparative vantage point, having studied and talked to many oppositions in competitive authoritarian regimes, the Democratic Party, for all of its many limitations and failures, which we can talk about for hours, is in comparatively good shape. Most oppositions in 21st century competitive authoritarian regimes are weak and very often fragmented into many pieces. They are often deeply ideologically divided. The two main opposition parties in the first two elections, so the first decade of Orban's authoritarian rule in the 2010s, the main opposition was divided into a socialist party, center-left party, and a far-right party that was to the right of Orban. They couldn't unite. Whether it is Mexico or Venezuela or Peru or El Salvador or Turkey, you have remarkably weak, fragmented, and often discredited oppositions that don't have the wherewithal, the financial, the organizational, the electoral capacity to go head to head with the government. In this case, the Democratic Party won. Really important. It is the opposition for, you could talk about divisions between the center and the left, all you want. It is a single unified opposition party, which is critical. That party is well financed. That party is well organized. That party is electorally viable. And so, there's lots to debate regarding the strategy of the Democratic Party, but it is, I cannot think, quite honestly, of an opposition in a competitive authoritarian regime in the 21st century that was in better shape than the Democratic Party. Use that as a point.
Interesting. So let's maybe talk about the future of the Republican Party then. I think some folks in the audience have mentioned in their questions they submitted in advance that Marjorie Taylor Greene's sudden announcement of her impending departure from Congress has been seen by some as an important signal that Trump is losing control, or at least a monopoly of control over his party. And the growing reality of his lame duck status is something that many in the Republican Party are now accepting and are beginning to act upon, even if Trump himself thinks or insists that he'll make a play to stay in office in 2028. So my own sense is that Trump is still quite in charge of the GOP, and that Marjorie Taylor Greene was as much expelled from Congress as she was resigning from it in terms of his own kind of way of relating to her. But I was curious about your own sense from prior cases or comparative cases about whether and how far-right parties undergo their own realignments. So I know Dan Ziblatt has quite a lot to say about this, but are there pathways through which the Republican Party would return to more of a center-right party, say?
Very hard to say, because this party is two things. One, is very much in transition. I mean, the degree to which the Republican Party has evolved over just the last 15 years since the rise of the Tea Party is stunning. I mean, it is, when you think about it, certainly if you compare it to the early 21st century, it's pulled a 180 on many of its major programmatic positions. The party used to be broadly pro-immigrant. It used to be pro-free trade. It used to be pro-market. It used to be internationalist and very aggressive in foreign policy. The bulk of the party has abandoned all of those tenets. So it's in rapid flux. It's also a really charismatic party right now. The only time in modern history that I know of, we have a political party that is essentially owned by a single individual that is really factionless. I mean, even the most towering of political leaders, Reagan, FDR, had factions within their own party that were not fully in line with their policies and that resisted them. And so the degree of control that Trump has achieved over the Republican Party in the last 5 years is unprecedented in modern American politics. And that makes the evolution that destabilizes the party. It makes the evolution harder to see. I don't see any evidence based on public opinion and based on where the activist bases in the party are. I see no evidence that this is a party that's going to return to being a sort of suburban center-right party anytime in the near future. I think it is heading in the direction ideologically of sort of ethno-nationalist, illiberal right, pretty similar to the far right in Western Europe. I think that's very likely to continue. I think there will be a fight over whether it becomes a sort of broadly establishment ethno-nationalist party or becomes a really sort of fascist party, right? We're now seeing openly fascist views within the party. This is the price you pay for tolerating and encouraging these guys, is that they grow and that they're a real threat within the party. So they could become a more or less, I don't know what institutional far right party that broadly plays by democratic rules of the game, or they could become a really dangerous far right party, and that will depend on the battles that occur post Trump. I think Trump's personal control over the party means that the succession is likely to be very, very messy. Personalistic leaderships usually do not. I think it's very unlikely we'll see a smooth succession to J.D. Vance. I think you'll see many, many, many battles and uncertainties between now and then. And so it's really hard to predict which path the party follows. But from everything I can see, looking at public opinion within the Republican Party, looking at who has energy and ideological momentum in the party, I don't see any base in the party for a return to country club center-right republicanism. This is going to be some form of illiberal ethno-nationalist right.
Thanks for that. So we're going to head into audience questions at this point. And the first question is, can you speak to the implications of the charges of sedition against the Democratic lawmakers who released the video? So the questioner says, for context, Senator Mark Kelly and several other military and I think intelligence officer veterans released a video encouraging current service members to disobey illegal orders. And now, in addition to the public statements by Trump that they should be tried and in some cases hung for these comments, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is now launching an investigation of Mark Kelly, or says he will, threatening to court-martial him within the military. So this seems like activity that's par for the course and backsliding contexts of attempting to criminalize opposition members in particular, especially when they act like opposition members, right? By releasing a video that is implicitly critical of the current president. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of this, like both in comparative contexts and in our context right now?
Well, it's certainly typical. I think the administration is much less likely to get away with it, to kind of foreshadow where we're going to end up, but it's certainly typical. I mean, authoritarians of all stripes do not tolerate opposition well. They tend to equate opposition and criticism with subversion and sedition. And you know, they view opposition as enemies and as traitors. And Trump, it's a mix of a couple of things. I mean, Trump himself has truly fundamentally authoritarian instincts. I mean, you don't see too many people grow up in the United States and attend U.S. schools and be so under-socialized in terms of basic liberal democratic norms as Donald Trump. It's a really extreme case. The guy has the political instincts of a tin pot dictator. I mean, so that he would view opposition as sedition, I mean, that's just instinctual for Trump. But there are two other type of actor within the government that are playing along. One, there are a bunch of loyalists who are willing to carry out his crazy orders, or to will try to implement his authoritarian instincts in order to please him. And I would put Hegseth in that category. And then you have a small group, but dangerous group of really ideologically authoritarian types like Stephen Miller, who really want to create, who you could see, particularly in the aftermath of the Kirk killing, an effort to try to create an atmosphere where they really could kind of use a sense of violence and threat to crack down on opposition in a way that we haven't seen in the United States in a very, very long time. And so you have various actors besides Trump who are pushing this kind of criminalization of opposition agenda. You know, they already failed in the Comey and James cases. It looks like it does not seem likely to me, we can get into details as to why, that that they can get away with this. And in fact, I think that this is backfiring in a pretty big way. Trump's reaction to that video, which I think was a pretty important video, his reaction to it magnified its impact and its diffusion in U.S. society by a lot. And so we're spending many more days talking about the content of that video, thanks to Trump's exaggerated reaction to it, than would have happened if he'd just ignored it. So on the one hand, this is among the most, obviously, talking about the death penalty for opposition legislators is about as radical as you can get. I mean, Orban doesn't do that. Erdogan doesn't do that. Hugo Chavez never did that. So on the one hand, it's extremely radical. On the other hand, it's very unlikely to be achieved or anything remotely like it.
Yeah. Can you, so the next question is, can you share more about the importance of state legislatures to protect their constituents against chaos at the federal level? I suppose this can be interpreted a few ways. One is the ability of state legislatures to be kind of an institutional beachhead for democracy. And the other is seeing them as you know, an institutionally legitimate way of either supplying public services to their constituents, as we saw in some cases around releasing or kind of stopgapping STAP funding, and providing some of the public services that the federal government has withdrawn. So what is your sense about state legislatures and the role that they're playing right now in protecting democracy?
Well, I think in general, much like the first Trump presidency, especially during the pandemic, the disinterest of the federal government, of the administration in governing, the combination of disinterest in governing and the occasional threats it's posing to the rule of law, leaves an outsized responsibility with state and local governments. I mean, to the extent that we wanted some kind of public response to the pandemic, we had to turn to state governments often in 2020. And as you noted, during the shutdown, the Trump himself seemed completely uninterested in resolving this problem, in attending to the huge costs that were being paid by individuals during the shutdown. And again, yeah, it fell to state and local governments. Now, our state legislatures, in part because of gerrymandering, are all over the map in terms of their politics. Some of them are deep red because they are heavily gerrymandered and give pretty far-right Republicans a supermajority in the legislature, which allows them to do whatever they want. I mean, I would put Texas in that category, for example. Others are obviously deep blue. But state legislatures are much closer to the electorate and to citizens than the federal government. And I think some of the resistance, for example, that we're seeing to Trump's call for gerrymandering is a response by even Republicans in some state legislatures to the notion that this is not popular, that some of the stuff that this administration is doing is just not popular. And so state politicians who are looking to the medium term, who are looking to build a career, maybe to be a governor, to be a congressperson, and are thinking about winning votes in 5 or 10 years, are starting, I think, to look past Donald Trump. And that may be a key source of moderation and a key, even in some red states, a break on some of Trump's worst impulses.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's interesting too to see two major kind of political moves coming out of states, not necessarily legislatures, but certainly governors and attorneys general offices, which is, first of all, the huge raft of litigation that is brought against the federal government around a huge variety of issues that are adjacent to or directly related to democracy, whether that's federal funding cuts of block grants and things like that. That the argument is they need to happen through Congress, not through executive actions, and basically suits that are being brought in on a really wide variety of issues. The second area in which state governments seem to have been really important is in kind of bonding together to try to cooperate on things like public health. So there's sort of new public health collectives, I think, in the Pacific Northwest and in New England, for example, where it's really governors that are trying to collaborate on vaccines and things like that, and research funding for these things to try to effectively substitute for what the CDC and other federal actors would otherwise be doing. And so, I'm not sure that that's all directly related to democracy defense, but it's really important because it legitimizes good governance and shows what it looks like, and it's responsive to constituents, and that itself is good for democracy. So, as they say, all politics is local, and being able to continue to be responsive provides people with experiences of democracy that then they can rightly expect of their leaders at all levels. The next question is, if someone were to want to spend $100 million to try to prevent authoritarianism and autocracy in the United States, what would be the best way to allocate that?
$100 million. Wow. I think right now, so I'm gonna I had not thought about this question. So Erica, you should.
Me neither. I want you to answer first.
you think while I filibuster. There are that it is critical to defend democracy that opposition movements broadly defined have resources. And that's actually an advantage that US society has compared to El Salvador, compared to Nicaragua, compared to a bunch of authoritarian regimes. We have a big private sector with deep pockets. Now, that private sector, and we have dozens of law firms that earn more than $1 billion in revenue a year. There's a lot of money out there. The richest among us have been the first to acquiesce to the Trump administration's bullying, and that has, in fact, meant that a number of civil society organizations are not getting the legal defense that they need, and they're not getting the funding that they need. Foundations are pulling back from supporting, I'm talking about civil rights organizations of all kinds, voting rights organizations, groups that defend different kinds of minority rights, progressive organizations in general that make up a key part of our opposition civil society are not getting the funding that they would have gotten a few years ago. They're not getting the legal support that they would have gotten a few years ago. So there is, in fact, a good use of, or good, there are places that one could spend money just filling in the gaps where other rich folks have sort of chickened out and retreated to the sidelines. I think, and Erica may disagree, really good lawyers are really important right now. I mean, the election fight is one huge fight in the year to come, but so many fights are going to be waged in the courts, because courts are still independent. And that a lot of the battles, one key arena of struggle in the next year is going to be the courts, as it has been. And different organizations are just going to need a lot of lawyers and money to pay for good lawyers. I know Mark Elias is involved in, I don't know how many dozen election-related lawsuits. Protect Democracy is involved in dozens of lawsuits. The ACLU is involved in I don't know how many lawsuits. They are under strain, and they're going to need support. So, buy lawyers. That's what we need. More good lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's true. Legal strategies and legal support is a big need, and an investment there wouldn't be a mistake, that's for sure. I also think, as you said, Steve, like just in general, there's a lot of opposition groups right now who are doing the work on the ground. I mean, they're organizing their communities, they're doing all kinds of mutual aid. They are trying to help people think about how to deal with the chaos that is sort of visited upon them by bad policy. They're trying to help families that have lost someone in the ICE operations, right? There's all kinds of stuff happening, and I think giving groups like that as much breathing room as possible by not having them worry about where their next grant is going to come from is a good investment. And in part because, as you said, Steve, the associational life of American civil society is really the stuff of democracy. I mean, people are going to experience democracy the most where they live. If they're not experiencing democracy the most where they live, they're certainly not going to experience it at the federal level. And so giving people lots of civic containers for finding their way in and what their political home is, where they can really engage and commit, I think is absolutely critical in normal times, and especially in times of national crisis. So yeah, look to see who's helping on the ground, I would say, and give them a boost.
I think it's very interesting that neither of us mentioned giving money to candidates, and which is not to say you shouldn't give money to candidates, but I think there's a tendency that the candidates will find you more quickly than the small organizations, and so the candidates are the shining object that are sending you texts. They're sort of they're the easiest to give money to. I think sometimes we overspend on candidates. Sometimes candidates who are not going to win, but also given the very rapidly changing media and particularly social media landscape, the relationship between money and election outcomes is not as clear as it was a decade or 20 years ago. And so I'm not saying don't give money to candidates, but it's not clear that that's always the best investment.
So the next question is about No Kings. Someone wants to get an assessment of the strategy there, and a few weeks out from the big mobilization on October 18th, I guess what we both make of it. So I'll start with you and then I'll weigh in.
Oh, well, I really want to defer to you. I think there are three key arenas for opposition to this authoritarian offensive. One of them we've talked about is at the ballot box. Another one we've talked about is in the courtroom, and a third one is protest. I was going to say the streets. It's not just the streets. There are many, many, many different ways for citizens to protest. But very fortunately, because this is not true in all competitive authoritarian regimes, all three of those arenas still remain pretty open. There was some tangible fear. I think we talked about this prior to the last No Kings rally, because the administration had begun to really amp up its efforts to militarize the cities, and there was some fear that among citizens about going out to do the most basic form of protest, but that arena continues to be open, and it continues to be really important. I'm not really able to gauge either the effectiveness of the strategy or the sort of outcome. So I look forward to hearing from you, Erica.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing a skeptic could say about this whole conversation is, well, if the courts are relatively open and the elections are happening fine and people can still protest, like, are we really in like a competitive authoritarian system? Now, I know what I would say about that. I think it's clearly true that we are, and that it is being contested very powerfully on all three of those fronts, and it's incredibly important that it is. So, what I would say about the No Kings protests, which is different from the strategy, but the protests themselves, one of the reasons they feel so important is precisely because it's so important to mark at times that there's still a visible opposition, and a huge base that can be mobilized to take risks and come out and commit, a day of the week to be together and register their opposition to what's going on. And it's especially important as that becomes more dangerous because it becomes a more powerful signal of the level of resolve and commitment by people to engage in opposition over time. The other thing is that the protests were growing in size over time, right? So it wasn't just, usually it's the opposite. There's one huge kind of protest and then things dwindle over time. It's been the opposite here. We've seen like a ramping up in each subsequent event in terms of participation, and I should say notice of various kinds by different constituencies, news and otherwise. And then the third thing I'll say is that the protests themselves aren't the only part of No King's strategy. From what I can tell, these are like punctuation marks between kind of periods of intense deliberation, training, strategizing, organizing, political education in some respects, and then there are these kind of large days of action that demonstrate the power that's been built through popular participation. And I would also say, protest is not the only tactic that the No Kings kind of formation has been interested in. And one of the things that, for example, Indivisible called for in recent days is people unsubscribing from Spotify because Spotify was running ICE ads. And so there's more of I'd say, appetite for or steer toward economic non-cooperation, things like boycotts, consumer boycotts. There's one that is going to begin that they're calling for this week, together with Black Voters Matter and a number of other organizations, to run a campaign they're calling "We Ain't Buying It," and it's basically using consumer boycotts against three corporations that they view as too aligned with the Trump administration and particularly its immigration policies. And so, I think here, what there is to know is just that there's a really important role for mass mobilization in generating costs for authoritarian backsliding, political costs, economic costs, because the way that the backsliding stops is that you start getting people defecting from the autocrats' coalition and saying, we're not going along with it anymore because it's too costly. And there are only so many ways to impose those costs. One's at the ballot box. Another is through legal action, but sometimes that doesn't actually impose the costs that people expect. And the other is through withholding dollars, withholding labor, and signaling public discontent. And so I think it's really important, or maybe especially important, in backsliding episodes to not underestimate how vital it is for people to continue to publicly speak in opposition. The reason you get the ability to maintain protest is that you are willing to do it. You can easily imagine how much more of a dire the situation would be if there'd been nothing going on all along.
Can I say two things really quickly?
Yeah.
First of all, absolutely right on consumer boycott is another form of protest. I mean, one advantage that blue states have is blue states have a lot of consumer power. And I think boycotts can be very, very effective. Secondly, just one comment on the No Kings protest, and here I'm speaking to one of the great experts in the world on nonviolent protest, but we have to remember that prior to this protest, which was in the aftermath of the Kirk killing, this administration was actively looking for a reason to crack down. They were looking for incidents. They were looking for provocations, even the smallest of provocation, to crack down, and they couldn't find one. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how many individual protests took place on that day, but not a single significant incident of provocation, that is a level of discipline that I could not have imagined. Really, really important. This could have gone a very different direction.
Absolutely. And, you know, one thing that is true is that the No Kings kind of formation had a number of trainings over the summer. One of them was an online training that had something like 150 plus thousand people joining. And these were basically nonviolence trainings and non-cooperation trainings in order to exactly create the capacity for large-scale mobilization through nonviolent resistance and the ability to basically not take the bait and not succumb to provocations that were sure to come down the line. And I think the fact that that's how it played out on October 18th in particular is, you know, speaks to exactly what you said, a level of extraordinary, like maybe even historic levels of discipline, and a lot of capacity to build on from there. So, Steve, I think we're out of time for today, but we'll get together again in a couple of weeks and see where we are on the roller coaster. I have to say, you sound a little bit more optimistic today than you did on the last call.
I am. I think the events. It's way too early to say that this was a turning point. We will not know that for some time to come.
Mhm.
And I cannot stress enough that this administration can still do a lot of damage on a number of fronts. But the opposition victories in the courtroom, at the ballot box, on the streets, in the last month have been really significant. And it has left me more optimistic.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I hope everybody has a good Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next time on the